I will introduce the moderator and request the moderator to introduce the 4 distinguished speakers in the first panel. The moderator is a national treasure of Singapore. Kishore Mahbubani. It's not, sorry, don't laugh, It's not a joke. Kishore Mahbubani is a unique individual. He grew up in very humble circumstances, and through sheer ability and hard work, he won a President's Scholarship. He then studied philosophy, which his friend thought was a bad choice, but it turned out to be a very good choice. Because Kishore has always maintained that studying philosophy is the best way to ensure that you think clearly, speak clearly, and write clearly. He then joined the Singapore Foreign Service, spent 37 distinguished years in our service, in which he rose to the highest rank achievable by a civil servant. He was the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He served twice as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, and during the second tenure, he represented Singapore in the Security Council and was twice president of the council. Since he left the Foreign Service, he's been Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And under his leadership, in a very short time, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy achieved global status. He has written 4 very provocative books. We love him in Singapore, but many of my friends in America hate him. So I always defend Kishore and said that a country needs loving critics and critical lovers. And I think Kishore is a loving critic of the United States of America. He's written 4 books, and the last of which is called The Great Convergence. He's always trying to tell me to sell his book, so please look out for his book, The Great Convergence. Now it gives me great pleasure to ask Kishore to moderate the first panel.
It takes hell of a lot to make an Indian blush. But Tommy succeeded. Minister, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my job is very easy. As the moderator of the panel, the brilliance will come from the participants. So I'm just going to follow in the footsteps of my guru, Ambassador Tommy Koh, and in his tradition make 3 points in my introduction. The first one is about the book in the context of time. 2, the meaning of the book in different cultures. And 3, a word about the speakers. And here, to begin about the meaning of the book in time, it so happened that a few evenings ago I was having dinner at home, my wife and daughter, and mentioned us coming here, and we were discussing how long the book has been around, 5,000 years, and we said, wow, boy, that's a very long time. And then I decided to look at some other statistics of time, and I realized that 5,000 years is actually not very long. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me just give you a few other illustrations of how long time can be. As you know, the universe began with the Big Bang, and that was 13.8 billion, with a B, years ago. Our solar system began 4.6 billion years ago. The dinosaurs were around for quite a long time, from 231 million years ago. The Homo habilis evolved to 2.3 million years ago, and the modern Homo sapiens came 200,000 years ago. So you can see again the backdrop of these statistics. 5,000 years, as they say, is as long as the fingertip on your body, and that's the meaning of the book in terms of overall time. And so that's why, in a sense, discussing the meaning of the book is such an important thing today. My second point is about the meaning of the book in different cultures. And here, I know that in the world today, there is some degree of pessimism about the future of the book. I mean, the general feeling is that with internet, with the social media, with anybody being able to publish, that the book is going to disappear. So I'm going to say something that's a bit more optimistic about the book and why I think it will remain strong and powerful as a force. And why do I say that? I say that because I do believe that we are moving into a new era of human history. And how do I characterize this new era of human history? Essentially, we are moving from an era where you had a mono-civilizational world to a multi-civilizational world. For the last 200 years, and this is no secret, the West has been dominating the world, and many of the other civilizations, for whatever reason, went to sleep. And the civilizations that went to sleep are awakening. Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, Arabic civilization. And so, what you might actually see in this century is a rediscovery of books that have been forgotten. And so in Chinese civilization, as you know, and indeed, they say that the oldest surviving dated printed copy of a book is apparently the Chinese version of the Diamond Sutra, dating back to 11th May 868. So in different civilizations, whether in China, in the Abbasid Caliphates, or in India, the book has played an important role for a long time. But many have been forgotten. And I believe that you will see a massive rediscovery happening in this century. So indeed, a new era of the book is going to emerge. And to understand that, frankly, we could not possibly assemble a better panel than the one you're going to hear this morning. And this is why now I'm going to invite the four distinguished panelists to come on stage to take their seats. Then I'll proceed to introduce each one of them one by one so that you can remember their illustrious history and background. Please. The first speaker will be Dr. Ismail Serageldin. He's the director of the Library of Alexandria, the successor of the Lost Ancient Library of Alexandria, and vice president of the Egyptian Academy of Science. He previously had a long career at the World Bank in various capacities, including being the vice president for environmentally and socially sustainable development. Dr. Serageldin was the previously professor at the Collège de France in Paris and a distinguished professor at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. He's an Egyptian, educated at Harvard and Cairo universities, and has authored more than 60 books and monographs. And actually, it is very impressive that, as you all know, despite the fact that Egypt is in the news, a lot of things are happening there, Dr. Ismail Serageldin showed his commitment to this event and his commitment to the meaning of the book by turning up today. And for that, a special round of applause for Ismail.
Thank you, Kishore. Thank you, friends. It's a privilege to be here with you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today, under the theme of the book by any name, we are exploring the role of the book in human civilization. Whatever the topic, whatever the platform, whatever the individual author, the book is central to any civilization. And today I will address two intertwined aspects: the book in the Arab-Muslim civilization and the extension of that in the last 500 years into the Western civilization. The Mediterranean has always been a crucible for the formation and the reformation of civilization through additive contributions of the various people on its shores. Initially, it was the role of the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean, with civilizations of Egypt, ancient Egypt, and Mesopotamia, and then Iran. Then the pendulum swung to Greece and the golden age of Greek philosophy and science, and then it swings back to ancient Alexandria for the great period of Hellenistic culture until Rome and the Roman Empire takes over, and then the dark ages in Europe correspond to the emergence of the Muslim civilization from Andalusia to Spain, all the way to India. And then the pendulum swings back to Europe after the Renaissance. So let me focus a bit about the period from the 7th to the 17th century, when the civilizations of the Muslim peoples were the dominant societies of books and learning. Now they say that the book helps preserve culture and identity. And I would argue that the Arab-Muslim culture was shaped by the book, not just preserved by it. Let me explain. First was the book, the Quran, which starts the whole Islamic civilization that today counts some 1.4 billion adherents around the world. And the revelation of the Quran in the Arabic language of Quraysh in the 7th century starts with the single word, read. Iqra. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, is absolutely central to all Muslims. And following and complementary to the book is the Sunnah or tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, through which, beyond that very first Quranic order to read, the Muslims are enjoined to learn and to seek knowledge. In fact, the search for knowledge, the word ilm, and truth, haqq, are an integral and undeniable part of the Muslim tradition. The pursuit of knowledge is the single most striking feature in a system of great revelation such as Islam. The word appears with its derivatives 880 times in the Quran. But knowledge is not perceived as neutral. It is the basis for better appreciating truth, which is revealed but can be seen by the knowledgeable in the world around them. Indeed, believers are enjoined to look around, to analyze what they see, to use their minds to learn the truth. And turning to the Sunnah or tradition of the Prophet, we find that he exhorted his followers to seek knowledge as far as China, which was then considered like the ends of the earth. And scientists were held in high esteem. The Prophet said, the ink of scientists is equal to the blood of martyrs. And in battles, prisoners from the ranks of non-believers could earn their freedom by teaching a Muslim to read. The Muslims recognized the Jewish and Christian religions and called their adherents the people of the book, Ahl Kitab. The early Muslims, when confronted with the advanced civilizations of Greece, Egypt, and Persia, did not reject them. They translated them into Arabic and wrote careful exegesis about them, and they preserved the legacy of Hellenic Greece and Hellenistic Alexandria, with its fabulous ancient library, whose destruction in successive fires, starting with Julius Caesar in 48 BC and ending with the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 of our era, resulted in a major loss to humanity when those 700,000 scrolls that it contained disappeared. But as distinguished scholars pointed out, the story of invading Muslim armies, burning it down on the order of Caliph Omar in 641 is total nonsense. It had disappeared 220 years before that. The early Muslims, in fact, when confronting the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, did not call for banning or burning their books. Indeed, they translated them into Arabic, they wrote excellent studies about them, and referred to them as al-Hakimain, the two wise men, and selected those parts of Greek philosophy that suited their needs and interests and rejected the other parts. Indeed, so great was the respect that they had for ancient books and learning that they undertook one of the most exciting, remarkable adventures of the human intellect. They recreated as close an institution to the ancient library of Alexandria as the world has ever seen. It was called Bayt al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom. Now we are at the beginning of the 9th century, and the Abbasid Empire stretches from Morocco to India, from Central Asia to Sudan. The capital is Baghdad. The new caliph, Al-Ma'mun, is the son of the legendary Khalifa Harun al-Rashid of Arabian Nights fame. All the Arabian Nights talk about the great Harun al-Rashid. And he was the one who would give a big push to this project of Bayt al-Hikmah. And he actually offered that anyone who would translate an ancient manuscript into Arabic would receive its weight in gold. Well, soon from all over the vast empire, manuscripts were being collected and translated and coming to Baghdad for translation. But also soon the vizier, Al-Ma'mun's Minister of Finance, said, "Sire, the scholars are cheating. They're using big letters and thick paper in order to increase the gold they will receive." To which Al-Ma'mun said, "Let them be. For that which they give us is infinitely more valuable than the gold we give them." All librarians must aspire to have rulers with such priorities. As a result of that enormous program of translation, Arabic became the language of knowledge and science within less than a century. But the program also helped gather the remnants of all the copies of manuscripts from the great ancient library of Alexandria that had remained anywhere within the boundaries of that vast empire. These were gathered back into the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, that as their owners rushed to have them translated and get their weight in gold. And the Arabic translations were copied many times over, and they traveled far and wide in the empire, as well as finding their way to Europe through Spain and Sicily and other points. In the vast Muslim empires of the Middle Ages, science and philosophy flourished along with freedom of expression and public debate. Rationality and experimental method were adopted at the end of the 10th century. Centuries before Bacon, Descartes, and Galileo, Ibn al-Haytham in the 10th century laid down the rules of the empirical method, describing how the scientific method should operate through observation, measurement, experiment, and conclusion. Listen to this description. We start by observing reality. We then proceed by increasing our research and measurement, subjecting our premises to criticism, and being cautious in drawing conclusions. And in all we do, our purpose should be the search for truth, not the support of opinions. Likewise, listen to the voice of Ibn al-Nafis in the 13th century on accepting the contrarian view, subject only to the test of evidence and rational analysis. He says, "When hearing something unusual, do not preemptively reject it, for that would be folly." The Arabic word is taish. "Indeed, horrible things may be true, and familiar and praised things may prove to be lies. Truth is truth unto itself, not because many people say it is." That's amazing, an openness to a contrarian view of this kind. Now, this is the Muslim tradition that must be revived. If the Arab world, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, and the Muslim world, Arab and non-Arab alike, will indeed join the ranks of advanced societies of our time, rejecting politicized religiosity and reviving these traditions would promote the values of learning and science in our societies, the values of the book. Books, whether printed or electronic, and the learning they symbolize would once again be at the center of our social fabric. We would once again become learning societies that participate in the production of knowledge, not just in the consumption of technology. Returning briefly to the case of 9th century Baghdad, we note that when a great philosophical debate occurred around the divine origin of the Quran, and there was a Mu'tazilite school held that it was physically created even if the inspiration was divine, while mainstream Orthodox view held that every word in the Quran was divine, there was hardly any violence. And the most that was done in the case of Ibn Hanbal, a great jurist who opposed Khalif al-Ma'mun's open support of the Mu'tazilite school, was that he was jailed for a while. Now this was a very mild rebuke given the medieval practices well known elsewhere in the Mediterranean at the time. But not all societies in the Middle Ages were so sympathetic to learning and books. Baghdad, with its fabulous house of wisdom, was destroyed by Hulagu and his Mongol armies in 1258 BE, now current time. There are very few examples of Arabs or Muslims burning books or destroying libraries. One such example in the 12th century was when the writings of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, as he is known in the West, were burnt, but he was allowed to depart from Andalusia and copies of his books were safeguarded elsewhere. By and large, these were rare incidents in a world defined by its openness to all cultures, where they would bring Indian numerals with the marvelous invention of the zero and use it extensively and add to it and pass it on to Europe, who would refer to the 10 digits as Arabic numerals. This is the Muslim Arab world where scholars such as the Jewish scholar Maimonides or the Nestorian Hunayn ibn Ishaq could flourish and develop their ideas. What a difference from the European tradition of the time, where up to 500 years later, the Inquisition did not allow discussion, and Giordano Bruno was burnt alive in 1600, and Galileo barely escaped with his life in 1633. But that impressive legacy is to be appreciated for its relative respect for books and scholars, relative to what was happening elsewhere in the world. For the Muslim East also had their martyrs. Most famous among them was the mystic Al-Hallaj, who was atrociously put to death in 922 in Baghdad. But these cases were very few, as there was no comparable centralized authority similar to the medieval church in Europe and no doctrinal enforcement body similar to its Inquisition. Now, it's important to recognize that this openness to culture and to science of all kinds from all corners of the earth was to remain a marking characteristic of the Arab Muslim cultures of the East for over 1,000 years, well after the advent of the Ottoman Empire. And then decline set in. The torch passed to Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Printing had been invented, mass production of books became possible, and with an expansion of readership, the evolution of ideas of the Enlightenment, and the momentum of the post-Renaissance scientific revolution, Europe was to acquire its new burst of creativity, innovation, science, and technology, and would go on to dominate the world, frame contemporary thinking, and reinvent the global institutions of today. Europe and the American societies built by European immigrants in the Americas would become the new custodians of books, freedom of expression, and open debate. This rise of Europe coincided with the decline of the Islamic societies, almost all of whom would be colonized by Europe and would gradually regain their independence in the 20th century. We still have a lot of catching up to do. Today, even as the world explores the marvels of the genes and breaks down the secrets of the atom and reaches to the stars and calculates the age of the oldest rocks, some in the Muslim world debate the importance of growing beards or whether a woman's nail polish prevents her from having ablutions. Others want to recreate their own vision of a mythical past in the 21st century by imposing their own narrow perspective as they look with suspicion on the new and try to erect barriers to limit where our minds may range. But they shall fail. It is only by returning to our legacy of respect for learning and our love of books, books be they electronic or printed, books in any form, books by any name, only by that will we, the contemporary Arab Muslim societies, be able to relink with our past legacy of greatness, rationality, and pluralism, and become once more major contributors to the formation and production of knowledge, real artisans of the exciting journey of discovery that the future is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail. I'm impressed by your precision. That was exactly 15 minutes. I can tell you've been in Singapore a long time. That was fascinating, wasn't it? In terms of making us understand what an important role, the Abbasid Caliphate played, and how you preserved the book for 1,000 years for humanity. So now we come to an equally fascinating speaker, Professor Wang Gungwu. He's University Professor at the National University of Singapore. Most importantly, Chairman of the Board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, therefore my boss. And he's also Chairman of the East Asia Institute and Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. He's also Emeritus Professor at the ANU in Canberra. He previously served as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong and Director of the East Asian Institute at NUS. He has held professorships of history at the University of Malaya and at ANU. He's an Australian, educated at the University of Malaya and the School of Oriental and African Studies, and has authored dozens of books, the most recent of which is Renewal, The Chinese State and the New Global History, and it'll be launched at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the end of the month, and you're all welcome to the book launch. But here we hear Professor Wang Gungwu. Gungwu.
Thank you, Kishore, for advertising my book as well, saying nice things about me. I'm tremendously honored to be invited to participate in this summit of the book. People like Tommy and Kishore knows that I love books. My biggest problem is where to put them. And my wife and I have had long, long conversations about what to do with the book or the books. So I have a special problem with the book. I love them. I also love libraries where I think the books belong, not to private homes only, but to the libraries, and I greatly respect the whole tradition of libraries throughout history. But the great libraries of the world today are just absolutely the core of civilization in my mind. So I'm so delighted to be associated also with the newly recovered library in Alexandria. I had the pleasure of visiting. The Library of Congress, of course, we all know, the mother of all modern libraries. And I was given the task, however, of talking about China. But before I do that, let me just say that because of my concern for books, I've been fascinated with two particular problems of books. One concerns the power of the book, and the other concerns the concept, the idea that the book empowers us. There are many ways of talking about a book, but I picked on this one because I think it's quite appropriate in talking about the book in Chinese civilization to talk about the power of the book, and in that context, how to protect that book that is so powerful, and also in that context, how to understand how the book empowers us or empowers people, one small group of people or large groups of people, depending on how you look at it. So let me begin by simply saying that I cannot quite imagine how, but I like to compare the delight of children today when they discover words in the computer and how these words string together, and how somehow in the computer those words become a sort of book. In fact, the book for many. Because I think that was probably how the Chinese, ancient Chinese, like all our ancient people, first discovered the power of the word. Words, when they discovered words, or discovered in the case of the Chinese, how to depict sounds that they made, how to depict the things that they saw and how to write them all down, how to do that. That moment must be absolutely amazing moment, wondrous moment. And then to be able to realize the importance of that discovery and put them together, eventually packaging them in what we call the book. And that took many forms. Writing, as you know, went through many, many stages, and putting writing down so that it can be there forever to be read was a major technological innovation, a revolution in many ways, way back. And the stages of doing that the Chinese went through are really fascinating. I mean, the way they put it down, first in stone, on tortoise shells, and how they use them to seek the answers from the gods, as it were. And in a way, the beginnings of a spiritual discovery of the man's relations with the gods, and using words for divination to find out what our past and future would be, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, you can see that this is a question of power, empowering themselves to use the word to understand better, to use the word to transmit their ideas to future generations, so that all that wisdom and knowledge can cumulatively lead to greater and greater things in the future. So the optimism underlying the discovery of the word and the discovery of how these words can make books, and how books can really bring continuity to our world, that is wondrous, as you can imagine. And when the Chinese did that, it is quite interesting that, to begin with, they only had basically 3 books. Ismail talked about 1 book, but the Chinese had actually more than 1. But I would say essentially 3 to begin with. And the 3, I think, in themselves illustrate this wondrous sense of power that the word and the book gave to the people. First, I mentioned earlier already, divinity, reaching out to the spiritual. And it's a book of change. We don't know exactly when that book was put together, but it was a very, very long time ago, and probably was the first book that the Chinese really put together. And it is astonishing that that has come down to us today. It doesn't actually belong to any religion. It doesn't actually belong to any particular school of thought. And yet, it has been pervasive in its influence upon all the people of China and all the people in the East Asian civilization at one point or the other throughout a long period of time. And there's no particular school that carried it. There's no religion, no building, nothing that actually represents the Book of Change, and yet it has come to us almost intact with lots and lots of commentaries and so on over the centuries. But nevertheless, it has been there, and it doesn't represent any particular group, any particular power group. And yet it has a mystical power that has persisted all these centuries and has actually influenced the lives of billions of people over time, and still is one of the most influential books among the Chinese people in one form or the other. The second one they also put together were that they put down together all the songs, what they heard, the songs and so on. That became the basis of the book of poetry. And these book of poetry had, again, gone through many, many kinds of interpretations and commentaries, but the essential part of it was it captured a sense of aestheticism, the aesthetic sense of responding to beauty of sound, beauty of words, and letting the words express, capture some of the beauty that they saw in nature and around them. The third book, however, is the most interesting in many ways. It is a book of documents. Some people translated it as a book of history, but book of documents. It is the realization that these words in the form of a book can record events, and that these records can determine the future. Because by having records down, you work out the precedents for what to do in every conceivable circumstance, and you evolve and you imagine new ways of dealing with things as long as you have a record of the past to look to. And the Book of Records was a third of the books. These three books have no single authors, no authors. They were put together. We don't know exactly how. All sorts of reasons have been given. But of course, it wasn't until about 3,000 years ago that these three books were seen and recognized as the key to Chinese civilization. At least they were not aware that they were actually constructing a civilization, but they used these three books to provide the kind of power that the people needed to live in the world, to understand it, to appreciate it, to love it, and to be able to transmit through the ages to generations to come. That sense of continuity came from those three books. Eventually, of course, to cut it very brief, the problem became, what do you do with the books? What other books flow from them? And when there were too many books, or many, many more books, how do you determine which books should survive, which books should not? How do you select from them? And so on. And that is where the power of the book became the empowerment of people, the people who selected the books, the people who decided which books should be used and which should not be. And then we have a series of problems. And so let me say that I believe that we don't only have to worry about the power of the book. I think that's not so much to worry about. It's who is empowered by the book and how power is used or abused in treating the book. So how do we protect the book from the empowered? That's another issue to my mind. Historically, I think this has always been a problem because people in power recognize the power of the book and want to control it, want to determine which books should be used and which not, and determine also who should get access to books and who not. Ultimately, as in Chinese civilization, it took a long time. Ismail referred to burnings of books and destructions of libraries. The Chinese have been through that many, many times. The most famous of which, of course, when the empire was first united, brought together, Qin Shi Huangdi burned the books. But he burned them very selectively. He didn't burn that many books, but he chose the books that he thought would not serve his purpose, would not help his regime, and he burned them together with other things. And but that was a beginning. It was not the first, but it was the beginning of a systematic approach towards recognizing the power of the book, and therefore those in power had to have power over the book. And I think that was a pretty important turning point in Chinese history. It determined the nature of the Chinese state and the way it functioned thereafter to a large extent. But actually people forget, although Qin Shi Huang burned books, and the Confucians have never forgiven him for doing that, the actual burning of the libraries was not actually done by Qin Shi Huang, but by the man who destroyed the Qin dynasty, Xiang Yu, who, at least in the Confucian context or in the context of Sima Qian, the historians and so on, a bit of a hero in some ways, but actually he was also very destructive. He was an aristocrat, very well educated himself and a very powerful soldier. But when he destroyed the Qin dynasty, he burnt down the whole city of Shenyang, including the libraries. And at that point, that was very serious because the Emperor Qin Shi Huang had gathered all the books together so that he could pick which books to preserve and which books to destroy. And having done that, that means the whole nation's books were all collected in one big library in the emperor's control, as it were, and Xiang Yu came along and he burnt the whole lot down. So one must remember that burning books is not only by choice, but also by a kind of thorough, inflammatory approach towards paper, or whatever, or manuscript, or whatever form they were in that time. Thereafter, the tradition has remained in many forms. Greatest respect for this powerful vehicle called the book, and also greatest anxiety about which books may be allowed to be used and which not, and so on. So that's a tradition that has continued to the present day. It did not only refer to Confucian books being burned by Qin Shi Huang, it referred to Confucians burning Buddhist sutras in the 8th century or 9th century when Emperor Wuzong had monasteries burned down and books also destroyed. It came down to the much later on. As late as the 18th century, one of the most famous examples was Qianlong Emperor and the the selection of books to be destroyed in building up the great library of the Qing Empire. And the selection of books, again, an enormous task, because by that time there were so many books. So they had a large staff of librarians, if I may call it. They were the scholars within the state who were invited to come and read through all the books and cut out all the bits they didn't want. It basically censorship and destroy all the books that the Manchus did not like, and only preserve the books that they wanted. So that was as late as the 18th century. And down to the present, of course, whether it was intended or not, that was the effect of the Cultural Revolution not too long ago. And I don't know how many books were destroyed then. Of course, we also hear about heroic librarians, heroic leaders who protected librarians and libraries, and the great National Library in Beijing and others, they were protected. They were protected. But throughout the country, the attitude towards the books, the attitude that there were books that should be destroyed and burnt, and there were people who were burning their own books for fear that the books might incriminate them in some way or the other. All that was happening, and that was just a few decades ago. So we're looking at a world in which not everybody loves the book in exactly the same way. And that's a factor we have to bear in mind. So when we say we love the book or books, we also have to be very clear what we mean by that. Do we mean loving it so that we preserve everything? Do we mean loving it so that we can protect the people from the power of the book? And when we talk about empowerment, is it only the empowerment of a few people, empowerment of the state, or empowerment of all the people as a check and balance of the state? All these have to be carefully weighed and understood. And I think we who want to protect the book because we love it, we have to face the reality that we cannot duck the problem. We have to actually confront it and face it and recognize that it is always an overhanging threat on books, knowledge, on the pursuit of truth, and all these things are not there, as it were, by the goodwill of all men. They are there within certain limits, and the constraints are placed upon that because there are also problems with what is a good book, what is a bad book. We cannot deny the fact that there are some books that don't deserve to be read. We have to recognize the fact that some books need to be read more often and better understood. All these have to be done. It needs discrimination, it needs efforts, and this, I think, it comes back to the point made earlier by the minister about the importance of libraries, librarians, the people responsible for making the best books available, to making all books at least available to some people, to at least preserve the record of past and present, good and bad, so that we know and recognize and can learn, at least we are able to learn from the past. All this is a very heavy responsibility on libraries and librarians, and this is where the book is to be protected. So to come back to the story, whether Chinese or elsewhere, the idea that books do need protection, and some people have to be given the responsibility of protecting it, and who to empower those people to protect it, that requires a lot of attention, a lot of care, and I think we can never, never stop being very vigilant about that if we really love the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gungwu, and I also want to thank you for being very precise in speaking 15 minutes. There must be some clock here somewhere that's telling the speakers when to finish. But it's interesting that both the first two speakers have spoken about episodes of book burning. And we seem to think that that's something that happened in the past, but will never happen in the future. I wonder, the warning that Gungwu was giving us is, let's continue protecting the books, and let's think about what the new threats might be. By the way, I'm really pleased now to introduce our third speaker, a colleague of mine from NUS, Professor Prasenjit Duara. He's the Raffles Professor of Humanities, Director of the Asia Research Institute, and Director of Humanities and Social Sciences Research at NUS. He has held professorships on Chinese and Asian history at Delhi University, Princeton University, George Mason University, Stanford University, and the University of Chicago. I don't know where he's not been. Professor Duara chaired the University of Chicago's China Studies Committee and subsequently chaired the History Department. He's an American educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Harvard University. He's the author of 5 books, the most recent of which is the Global and the Regional in China's Nation Formation. Prasenjit, over to you.
Thank you, Kishore. Thank you, Professor Ko, Minister Wang. There are so many ways to grasp the book in human history. It is really an immense task, and there's been a lot of scholarship. And so I will try to do it through the persona that I sometimes wear of a historical sociologist. Let me, I'm not sure how long this will take. I'm sure I'll be warned, so I will adjust it as such. I think what I want to do today is talk about 2 ways of thinking of the book over time. One is the historical functions of the book in enabling human projects, whatever these projects are, whether it is whole educational structures, political systems, events, and change, and also includes things like changes in the technologies of book production, the type of book, modes of information dissemination, whether religious or market, issues of ownership, copyright, publication authorities, and things like that, and of course censorship and burning. These, it seems to me, are very much relate to the functional quality of books, of information and education. There's the second element of the book that I want to talk about. And very interestingly, both our speakers earlier before me, who preceded me, spoke a great deal about this symbolic function, the symbolic role, the symbolic forms and status of the book. Whether as an individual book like the Bible or the Quran, or the various categories of the book. You know, and I was just, it's only after I started writing this essay, or this little note yesterday, that I noticed the importance of that sequence. You know, you start with the parchment, and then maybe that's a codex, but a codex has, not necessarily paper. And then you have, of course, the paper with the typewriter, and then you have the Kindle, right? Or whatever it is, the iPad. I'm not very familiar with these new technological ones. So there's this, you have, of course, different forms of the book. You have the manuscript, you have the codex, you have encyclopedias, and perhaps even PowerPoint. I thought I would present a PowerPoint today, but I was barred from doing that. So this is very much the book, not yet admitted. Now, in the history of the book, of course, we have a great deal of scholarship. There, in the last 50 years, you have, since Elizabeth Eisenstein, Robert Darnton, Roger Chartier, now in Chinese studies, you have Cynthia Brokaw and many others who are doing excellent work on the history of the book as in its functions and so on, and reveals a great deal. On the symbolic status and form of the book, it's more complex and more subtle, and so hence very interesting that both Gungwu and the librarian, Gerald, from has been able to speak so much about it. Now, you know, the thinking of the symbolic status of the book, I read an Israeli author, G. Strumsa, who mentioned that it was really after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE that the Torah became the repository of faith and everything sacred. In some ways, certainly in Western history, that was the first and very important development. And as a repository of the faith, in other words, as a replacement for the temple where you could perform these things, it could be carried with you, and it formed your whole self around it, how you read it, how you interiorized it. These were all very important developments, and the form of the Torah remains as it is. And the whole role of ethics and interiorization then became connected to the reading of the Torah and its meaning. So much so that the subsequent Abrahamic religions had the book very much at the center of the faith, right? So what you have, and then by 1873, I think it is Max Muller, the famous scholar, he introduces the idea of the religions of the book, right? Which gives you a very strong sense of the symbolic power of these kinds of books. Indeed, for the Quran, I was looking last night if there were, because of course we all know that to dispose the Quran is a very elaborate, how you dispose of it is a very elaborate affair, it's a ritual affair and so on. And it's not clear to me, and I may well be wrong, how one disposes of an online version of the Quran, or if it does exist an online version. The only versions I've heard are recited versions online. So I think these are interesting questions that will remain with us, the symbolic status of the book as we know it. The question of the historical function or the functionality and the symbolic status are, of course, hardly unconnected. They always go together. We have symbolic functions and we have functional symbols, right, of all kinds of things. And so they cannot be separated. And one of the things I was thinking about is thinking of what historians of the book call reading practices. How do you read a book, right? Do you memorize it? Do you have to, for thousands of years, you've had priestly communities that have basically memorized and then tried to understand, if at all. Right? And then there are other ways of reading it in certain contexts and so on, whether you read it as a reading group today or in a classroom or whatever, it has completely different meaning. And this sort of is a kind of a link between the symbolic function and the symbolic role and the historical function of the book in very, very important ways. I mean, the ways in which priests read it or monks can read a text also is a way in which they conserve their status and position in certain ways, right? And keep their... So these are sort of connected things. But I'm asking you today to make the analytical distinction for the sake of this presentation, because I think it may reveal to us ways of thinking about the book today, right? So let's keep these two apart. But let me talk a little bit more about the examples of connection and separability of the functional and the symbolic role. We know, for instance, that printing of the Gutenberg Bible led to radical changes in European history and world history, led to the Reformation and all of these things. But we know that it was because of the Bible and not any other or any old book, right? It was the Bible that led to such a mass production and such radical transformations. Here, what we get is the status of the Bible that pushes the function, right? Conversely, when you think of ancient Asia, although, of course, we know that writing in China on bamboo, on silk, in India on cotton, on palm leaf, birch bark, there's a whole type of medium of writing, were prevalent before the first millennia. More rapidly circulating forms, such as paper and woodblock, were developed in China first under the impetus of Buddhist missionary activities in 105 CE. Here, what happens is that the functional need spreads the status, right? It is the need to missionize that actually spreads this kind of functionality of it, which then also leads to the growth of status. So they're sort of interconnected in very interesting ways. Interestingly, in India and the Middle East, the functionality of printing was known. You've had woodblock prints in India on cotton and so on for a long time. But these were restricted because of the aesthetic and sacred character of writing. The calligraphic form and so on was much more important than the market function of spreading it or the missionary need of spreading it, right? In India, despite the non-adoption of print and the rapid climactic deterioration of the material on things which were written, they have now been discovering over 1 million pre-modern manuscripts are coming to light. Of course, there's a very rapid rate of deterioration as well, but some of the palm leaf works very well. In China, from an early period, they've been discovering these bamboo slats, and it's beautifully inscribed. And you know, their whole, it's not just writing on palm leaf or on so on. There's a stylus that creates an inscription, and then they process it so that the ink seeps in, but still over thousands of years. How am I doing? I'm just beginning. Okay, sorry. Maybe I'll skip some of this stuff. In China, the collection of books was such an important symbolic thing that there were homes that were called homes with the perfume of books, shuxiang. They were homes, shuxiangfang, right? You have these where you could smell the books coming out. And this was not just literati, it was merchant families who were imitating these people and so. Anyway, I want to talk about one more thing, which is the example of form and symbolism. Benedict Anderson, in his very famous study of imagined communities of nationalism, argues that it was printing in the form of the novel. And he uses Southeast Asian example, Jose Rizal and Pramod Anand Toer and people like that, who build up the idea of a national consciousness. It is the novel form, the way in which the novel is structured, the kinds of temporality and visuality that it enables, that it does this. But interestingly, the novel form, while its form and status was very important, very quickly in Asia, within a couple of decades, new media, right? Radio and later on cinema overtake that function, and the novel becomes insignificant in relation to nationalism in some very important ways. So I think we want to talk about the importance of a symbol and function in thinking about what makes a book, right? After all, what remains a book by any other name? Is a book something simply between two covers? Is it defined by the unity and of meaning or coherence of some kind within those two covers or within any space? Can the infamous fictional Chinese encyclopedia that Borges talks about, and which I'm sure most of you book lovers will know, the Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge, can it be considered a book? You know, he says there in this so-called encyclopedia, total fiction, how are animals divided? Animals are divided into those that belong to the emperor. That sounds like the most embalmed ones, those that are trained, suckling pigs, mermaids, fabulous ones, stray dogs, those included in the present classification, innumerable ones, those drawn with a very fine camel hairbrush, those that from a long way off look like flies, and so on, right? I mean, and this is, of course, this has prompted so many philosophers and thinkers to say, how do we conceive of coherence, right, in a knowledge? Can this be thought of, even if it's within two covers, can this be thought of as a book? I believe the relation between symbol and function is very important in addressing the question of what is a book, coming to the present now. The Anderson case suggests that although the printed novel was symbolically important, symbolized the nation, the function was overtook the symbolism of the book. The functional conveying of information has now been taken over by all kinds of new media that would be hard to call books. But whether it can fully overtake it depends on how we define a book. Can we call something a book if in its form it embodies a certain organized coherence of meaning? As long as it does this, this meaningful form, the symbolic status, will be subject to the symbolic webs of interpretations and interpretive practices that attend them, thereby giving it the status of a book. Moreover, the meaningful form that is the book has a commercial and legal expression today as well, right? In the issue of copyright. This is a very new phenomenon, incidentally, on the history of the book. This is, of course, something that will be increasingly contested, in my view. There will become ways of writing books that will not be authorially and legally represented, but it can still represent a coherent form. Already on the internet, we're beginning to get books of coherent form. It's very hard to place who's the author and who's not. The question is, who is asking about the book? The publishing industry may have a certain legal conception of the book. What about libraries? Are they entirely dependent on the publishing industry? Are there ways to organize public services for the new forms of the book? Can you coordinate and organize forms of meaning for the new type of heterogeneous book? And I think here will be the challenge for librarians. How do you sort of get proactive and move into that scene? Much like curators are doing in art museums and so on, you know. They're organizing meaning for you, right? Okay, I'll just stop here. I'm sure I've exceeded my time.
You can see he was just beginning to get going. You deserve 1 hour, Prasenjit. Okay, now we come to the last but not the least speaker, Professor Cathy Davidson. She's the Ruth F. DeVarney Professor of English, as well as the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Duke University. She's also a member of the National Council on the Humanities. She's the co-founder of Hashtag, which is a network of innovators dedicated to new forms of learning for the digital age. And she's also the co-director of the MacArthur Foundation, Gates Foundation, Digital Media and Learning Competition. She's an American, educated at Elmhurst College and Binghamton University, and is the author of 18 books, the most recent of which is entitled, this is the title, it's quite long, it says, Now You See It, How the Brain Science of Attention Will Transform the Way We Live, Work, and Learn. And she's going to test whether you still have the attention after hearing 3 speakers. So over to you, Cathy.
Well, it is an incredible honor to be here today. So thank you very much, and a great honor to follow such distinguished speakers. On April 22nd, 1993, the computer scientists who developed the Mosaic 1.0 browser decided that the internet should be available to all of us. Before that, it was mostly computer programmers, scientists, university professors, and government officials who used the World Wide Web to communicate their ideas. After 1993, is this loud? Can you hear me? After 1993, the rest of humanity was given a new and remarkable power. Anyone with an internet connection could publish a thought to anyone else anywhere in the world who also had access to an internet connection. No professional publisher or editor was there to guide you before you hit send to ensure accuracy, logic, or even common sense. The apparatus of publishing your ideas post-1993 is very different from the apparatus of publishing your ideas before the World Wide Web. The internet allows a method of open access and opportunity for a new kind of both amateur and professional authorship with a greater geographical reach than ever imagined before in human history. So the 2 questions I would like to address today are, first, what does access mean in historical terms? And second, how can the history of the book in human civilization help us to understand what we need to do in order to be responsible citizens in a post-1993 world where virtually anyone can be self-published instantaneously? Since the focus of our panel today is the meaning of the book in human civilization, I'd like to go all the way back to the beginnings of recorded civilization. Historian Robert Darnton argues that there have only been 4 great information ages in all human civilizations, times when the technology of human interaction changed so dramatically and decisively that there was no going back. The first of the 4 great information ages began with the invention of cuneiform writing in 4000 BCE Mesopotamia. This first form of human communication, as we all know, was commercial. But simultaneously with the recording of commodity transactions, poets were also recording their ideas and their words in clay tablets, as epic poems and myths, as imprecations to gods, as expressions of love. Writing down our deepest emotions is as much a part of the history of humanity as recording the trading of, say, frankincense, incense, and myrrh. Humanity's first information age moved slowly by today's standards, and not everyone liked it. Most famously, in around 370 BCE, Socrates was still complaining about the newfangled invention of writing. He argued that the written word reduced the complexity of thought and the mind-changing power of dialogue to a bloodless, static, and inferior form of mere representation. Fortunately, Socrates' brilliant student Plato recorded these ideas in the Phaedrus, or we would not know today that one of the greatest philosophers in Western civilization had a gripe against the book. The second great information age in human civilization, according to Darnton, also had a long duration. It was the invention of movable type. We in the West rather arrogantly used to say that this began with Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in 1450. Fortunately, and largely because of Wikipedia, a crowdsourced encyclopedia of all the world's knowledge contributed by anyone with access to the internet, those of us in the West now know in the very first sentence of the entry on movable type that there's a very long non-Western history of that printed book. The Han Chinese printer Bi Seng is now credited with inventing, in the West, credited in inventing with movable type somewhere around 1045. Movable metal type was also invented in Asia in the Goryeo dynasty in Korea in the 13th century. When the invention of movable type finally made its way to Europe in the Reformation in Germany, Gutenberg and his fellow printers were able to produce about 3,600 pages of print in one workday. That is nearly twice what could be produced by the earlier typographic form of block printing. And it was hundreds of times faster than professional hand copying. Not everyone liked it. Certainly the Catholic Church believed that in the wrong hands, the ability of non-clerical printers to produce books at a rapid scale would destroy human civilization. This is an important point. Each new development in the history of the book brings tremendous promise and equally tremendous concern about what such a change in the book will mean for the future. The fear is that a new form of printing will hurt the future of human thought, of human expression, and therefore of human civilization itself. I don't know if you can all see this. I'm holding up a very little book, a duodecimo it's called. This was the video game of the late 18th century. What I'm holding up is a version of Charlotte Temple. It was the first best-selling novel in America. It was mass-printed around the same time as the US Constitution. And it was this most popular genre of the third great information age in human history, according to Darnton. This was the era of industrial printing, machine-made paper, machine-made ink, steam-powered presses that made these cheap little books available to the masses, to middle-class and working-class people in huge numbers for the first time in human history. Not everyone was happy about that. Indeed, in the United States, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both worried that it would be bad for democracy and for the fate of the early republic if the masses could read all the books on their own. Before that, it was thought that you heard about content from your magistrate or your minister. Suddenly now, you could read your book in private on your own. The industrial information age of the late 18th and 19th centuries is my original field of scholarly specialization. I could not be a historian of the internet were I not earlier trained as a historian of the book. In Revolution in the Word, I wrote about the ways the revolutionary new mass printing fed the popularity of the literary genre of the popular novel, and how in turn the popular novel championed a more egalitarian progressive view of the masses and greatly disturbed the pundits of the time. In 1993, when the internet came along, I was surprised to hear modern-day pundits sound a lot like Jefferson and Adams. Our information age is characterized not just by instant and global access and abundance of information, but of the possibility of changing content, of rewriting the code itself. Hypertext markup language, HTML, the language of the World Wide Web, is designed for modding, for forking, for remixing, for mashup. In its architecture, it is designed to be changed. Authorship within the new information architecture of our fourth great information age in human civilization no longer has the same authority. So, to return to the first point I made, the history of access to print has upsides and downsides for human civilization. Complaining about a new form of the book is not new in human history. In every epoch, some people have celebrated and some people have fretted about too much information. So that brings us to the second major point I wish to address in our brief time. What does the past have to teach us about how to be responsible citizens in a world where virtually anyone can be an author? Interestingly, in past eras, education was almost always the place human civilization turned to cope with new technologies of the book. In fact, and I think this is very, very important, almost all of the apparatus of our current global systems of education today were invented in the 19th century to prepare us for the third information age. Here are a few things that we may not know were invented in that last industrial age to prepare us for the industrial age of print. Standardized tests, IQ tests, multiple choice exams, grades, professional schools, graduate schools, the idea of a major, the idea of a minor, the idea of a semester, the two cultures of the science and technology as one culture, divorced from arts, humanities, and the social science as another. I've got a list of about 100 different things that were invented basically between 1875 and 1925. Now, since 1993, we are teaching and testing our children much as they would have been 100 years ago. Our kids, and this is true around the world, go to school much as they did in the era of the Model T. The schools we have inherited were invented for the Fordist assembly line and for industrialization. Their aim was to turn farmers into factory workers, and on a different social level, to show shopkeepers how to be corporate employees. Now, since 1993, we have to rethink what it means to teach our children to learn in a world where they are the publishers of their own ideas. We have to teach them to read critically and how to contribute to their own content creatively and wisely. Rote memorization of a single discrete body of information prepares you well for a standardized way of thinking in the industrial age. But it does not teach you the best ways to interact with one another online anytime, from Facebook to Twitter, seemingly every day, seemingly all day. The meaning of print in human civilization has changed since 1993. Now it is our responsibility to transform education for our internet era, just as the industrial age changed it over 100 years ago. We must think together about the best new methods of learning for the interactive, crowdsourced, do-it-yourself, multitasking, global, and digital world of words that we all now live in together today. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Cathy. And thank you for being on time. That gives us about a half an hour for discussion. I'll begin with a couple of questions here. And I believe you'll be able to ask questions from the floor if you like after this. But I'm going to start by building on a point that Cathy made. It's interesting that you mentioned that, was it Thomas Jefferson and others were worried about the masses getting hold of the books and reading them. That would be very dangerous for the world. Well, we have reached that point today, as you indicated. I think that in the past, for centuries, a very small percentage of any society read books. Today, we are approaching in some societies close to 100% are reading books. Well, that's obviously changed the texture of human civilization, changed the texture of human history. And the big question is, will this create a more civilized world? And that's my first question. Ismail, what do you think? Before we ask the other panelists.
Thank you. I think the answer is definitely yes.
Yes. You're optimistic, huh?
I'm always very, very optimistic. I'm a great believer also in what youth is doing with texting and tweets and everything else. They'll invent a world that suits themselves, just as we invented a world that suited our generation. And for those who are always worried, I like to cite a poet who said that looking at the new generation, they were arrogant, they had no respect for their elders, they were very noisy, their aesthetics were terrible, their clothes were a disaster, and that when they grow up and take over, the world is going to collapse. Well, that was Hesiod in 700 BC. And I think,
things haven't changed.
Things haven't changed. Every generation, people get worried about what's going to happen when these rowdy kids grow up. I grew up in the 60s, and I think some of the people here have done that
That was the
too.
worst.
And many of the radicals and the hippies of the 60s are now CEOs and heads of corporations and banks, and politicians. And so that complaint and fear is always there. But the fact is that people are better educated, live longer, healthier lives than ever before. More people around the planet than ever before are living in relative freedom and have access to a lot of information they didn't have before. And that is definitely a very positive thing. So I have no fears at all. I think it's going to be wonderful.
Hallelujah. Now, Prasenjit, are you going to continue this optimistic tone?
Yeah. I'm not sure what tone I'm going to say. I think it really depends on for whom. I think for ever since Chinchu Huangdi, or as Gungwu told us, it was really Shangyu more than Chinchu Huangdi. It's clear that states are afraid of too much education. And it's really the kind of education, right? If you have functional education to equip you to do certain kinds of tasks, that's fine. But the problem, of course, with education is that it takes you much further. And so that is a problem. But I think the type of reading and education is very important. The type of reading, I think, is it also has to be one where we can, I believe, I certainly believe very much in the idea of a sustainable world, which I think is the greatest problem we face now. And so our education and reading has to be around that and promote that.
Okay, thank you. Gungwu, you want to say a word or two before we turn to Cathy?
Well, you're just asking a very, very powerful and very big question. I don't have the answer to that. But I'm intrigued.
No, I was trained in philosophy. I only ask big questions.
I'm intrigued by one particular technical way of determining knowledge and how it's passed on. And in a way, the invention of the library, putting books together and then cataloging them. I've been fascinated with the question of how the Chinese cataloged books before the Library of Congress did. And how you catalog a book is determined also by what you want the book to do. I mean, and whoever has the power to set the catalog system, determining how knowledge should be grouped, I think is very fascinating. For example, in the Chinese one, way back as early as the 3rd century, people started talking about categorizing books in 4 different categories. Eventually, by the early Tang Dynasty in the 7th century, this was formalized, institutionalized in a library where they talked about the classics and the history and the collections of other thoughts and handbooks, technology, science, and so on, and finally literature, broadly speaking, 4 categories. And that was confirmed. And what it meant, of course, was by classics, and this is where the power comes in. By classics, you determine the books that everybody must follow. So the category number 1, already the rest are sort of additional. They are sort of supplementary and maybe turn to if you want to. But the key rests in the classics. This was by the Confucians who chose the classics, and they selected very carefully, and all the commentaries to the classics and so on. And that continued right down to the time, and this comes back to the dating that was mentioned earlier on, when the Chinese adopted the more universal system that is developed in the West. And how did the Library of Congress catalog come about? And I was very intrigued by that too. What was the thinking behind that? For example, I was very struck by the fact that in the Library of Congress catalog, religion, philosophy has a very small section. Just the opposite of the classics. In the Chinese tradition, the classics occupies the most powerful section of the library. And in the Library of Congress, it was down to a very small bit, and all the others become bigger and bigger. Science and literature and history and politics, social sciences, all grew in. So that is the 19th century. So you refer to that. At some point or other, that was determined. The question in my mind is, what next? Who is going to work out the next catalog, and how do they determine what bodies of knowledge and how you construct the structure of the priorities of what you ought to know? And that would be intriguing to my mind.
Cathy, before I turn to you, Ismail wanted to add a word about cataloging.
Yes, it was my predecessor, the 3rd director of the Ancient Library, who turned to one of the many resident scholars that he had, of whom was Euclid and so on. This was a great poet, Callimachus. And he kind of told him, writing poetry is something you should do in your spare time. Do something useful. Prepare a catalog for the library. 3rd century BC. And for the first time, universal knowledge was organized by subject.
3rd century BC.
Yes, and then by author within subject, and then alphabetically by author, which pretty much is how we still do bibliographies to this day. And so Callimachus, even if he didn't want it, became the father, if not of library science, at least of bibliography writing. And it was through that catalog that we know how much we lost. So we know, for example, how many plays Euripides had done, 107, 108, and of which 18 survive, and so on, because that catalog, the Pinakes, which was in 120 volumes in scrolls in those days. So I think that the origin of classification of knowledge, just when people had more than a few documents, they really had to start organizing them to be able to find them around. But I think Gungwu's point about how much weight you give to each one becomes different. Mm-hmm. And today, electronically, that is further opening new questions.
Yeah. So, Cathy.
Well, I think the question of classification and the question of why we have to change the way we educate are intertwined, because right now, the way you categorize is by search. So if you're not careful, Google can own your classification system. In other words, when Wikipedia was invented, actually when Tim Berners-Lee invented HTML, there was a big decision point where they had to decide whether they wanted traditional classification systems for all knowledge or whether they wanted to leave an open architecture where anybody could classify and tag their own work. And HTML is based on an open tagging system. Wikipedia, when Wikipedia was invented, also, they had to decide whether there'd be formal classification systems or whether anybody could use anything. And they decided, let's leave it open. Let's let anybody, it doesn't matter whether the entry is on classical Chinese poetry or on 1985 VCR. will let anybody contribute any kind of knowledge at all. And that's one of the reasons that book, that it's the 7th most, I guess it's now the 6th most used website on the World Wide Web, and why the head of the Library of Congress and others have now said it's actually as accurate as any other general encyclopedia, all produced by non-experts, no taxonomy, right? But commercial interests can fudge the taxonomy, so when you search something, what they pay for can come up first. So this is why I believe that we have to really rethink what we're educating kids to. Because if kids don't understand that, first of all, the taxonomy is open, but second, it can be corporatized and fudged, then search looks as if it's universal, but isn't universal at all. It goes back to the point that was made by several people, actually, about the power of knowledge and who owns the power of knowledge and who controls the power of knowledge. To my knowledge, almost no school system in the world has rethought teaching to that kind of open but also corporatizable, commercializable condition of the modern world.
Great. Now we have about 20 minutes. Any questions from the floor? If not, I have one stupid question I can ask the panel. Either you've all been brilliant or you put the audience to sleep. Okay, who's got, see a hand here?
Excuse me, we have one here.
Okay, can you please, yes, you're in the corner there, yes.
Hi.
We can hear your voice even though we can't see you very well. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was very interested in the last speaker who mentioned this thing about education and the link to books. Personally, as a grandma of 2, I do believe that educating children for values for life is much, much more important than content. And education for using the tools of the internet is also so critical. And it does seem that our education system is at least 100 years behind time because of the speed of the internet revolution. So I really wonder, since our education minister is here, and many librarians are here.
I'm impressed, he's still here.
I'm very impressed. I'm very thankful he sat through all the presentations, because I think we do need this very international connect. And I also noticed that we have the so-called 4 big cultures represented among our speakers. So, well, like I said,
okay.
Being a publisher too, yeah. I do wonder what weight should we put into values education versus content education.
Great question. Cathy, we'll start with you.
Yes.
How do we preserve our values before the young generation destroys it again?
The great futurist writer Alvin Toffler said that the 21st century literacy is not the ability to, just the ability to read, write, and do arithmetic, but the ability to learn, full stop, unlearn, full stop, and relearn. And that the great value that we have to teach in a world that's changing as fast, that's as multicultural and multinational as the world we live in, is how we can actually examine and be introspective about our values and see which ones serve us and which ones do not serve us, in order to give ourselves the tools to help change the way we respond in the world. It's a very optimistic idea that we are able to change, but we simply can't change unless we have that ability to be introspective. And I think that's the biggest value I would teach. Much of the industrial age value system is about teaching content as if it is fixed, and as if education teaches you something that will then last you for a lifetime. There have been many studies of, the Australians did a study about 5 years ago that said 65% of 15-year-olds will end up working in professions that have not yet been invented. The OECD did one that said that this is in the US, 4 to 6 Americans, the average American changes careers, not jobs, but careers 4 to 6 times. Another one in the United States is by the age of 32, you've had 9 separate jobs. But our educational system is still based on the idea that content is like something you can measure, something finite, and not a disposition to learn, a disposition to openness, a disposition to think about other cultures, a disposition to believe you might have made a mistake, and that's something to learn from rather than something to be a failure. I'm sure it's similar in Singapore now. In the United States, the pressure on young people to get every answer right is quite astonishing. And I'm not sure that's right. I think we're failing our students in some profound ways by forcing them to think that getting the one best answer out of 5 possible choices is really preparing them for the world of the internet.
I think that's true for the content side of the picture, Cathy. But the question was, I agree, you got to learn, unlearn, and relearn for things like content. But on values, surely the values you learn should stay with you for the rest of your life. You don't unlearn your values. What do you think, Ismail? Yeah.
I think we do unlearn our values in the sense that the marketplace of ideas is constantly evolving. And, well, as many of us would remember, certainly from the days of our parents, many of our countries were under occupation. And there was a generally racist perspective that said the white race...
Racist perspective?
Yes, there was the white race was dominant, and blacks and Asians and others were subservient races. There was the burden of civilization, la mission civilisatrice, as was used during the colonial era. And people who were liberal in terms of even their thinking about democracy in their own countries, first of all viewed it as democracy for men, white men who happened to have property, not even women and other things. The evolution of these values is what counts, and the evolution of these values from generation to generation has happened through the mediation of debate and discussion through books and through ideas and through debates, and ultimately ideas are the most powerful thing there is. And just 2 examples of that. One is a great statement by Victor Hugo, who said basically, no army can defeat an idea whose time has come. And that is just, when you reflect upon it, it's an extremely powerful statement. And the second one is the example of how utopian ideas take hold. Take the example of 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most people said this is totally utopian. What the hell has this got to do? The world, the Cold War, etc., realpolitik, decolonization hadn't even started. Well, it took 30 years to get the 2 covenants, international covenants on civil and political rights and cultural rights. By the end of the century, not only did we have the Convention that, against discrimination against women, but we also had even the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And in the 21st century, there is no place on earth that you will go to and you will not find people demanding human rights as a fundamental structural element. So ideas change. And I think that what we need to teach our children is the engagement with ideas. As I mentioned in the 13th century, Ibn Nafis, when you hear something that is totally against everything, do not preemptively reject it. It may turn out to be true. It may turn out to be valuable. And this idea of engaging with new ideas is, I think, the essential part that will enable people not just to learn the new, but to invent the future and create better societies.
Prasenjit, I saw you picked up your mic, so are you going to agree or disagree?
Well, I agree with a lot of the things. I think that the value thing is very important. I think that what has happened globally in education is that there is, of course, given our contemporary society, an incredible need for technical knowledge acquired through, technical means. And this means, as we know, for most children and adolescents, it means devoting your life to certain types of textbooks and learning of that knowledge, whether it's rote or analytical or whatever. But I think that we need this, again, for ecological sustainability, We need a much greater balance. I think we have, and I still think that the liberal arts model, which I am not afraid to plug, the University of Chicago's liberal arts education, its college system and so on, is a wonderful model, but I think something else is also needed. That is in the early stages where you get a very complex engagement with ideas. But I also think we need engagement with our communities, with localities, with practical engagement in order to foster those kinds of values again, to make them meaningful.
Thank you. Gungwu, you add something on this question of values?
This is again another very big question, but let me try and put it this way. It seems to me that there are so many kinds of values and at many levels of values, and it's a matter of how you pair these values, because so many civilizations actually do it through a kind of dialectical process. You work out what is good and what is bad, and you sort of in between. There's a long way in between. But I think people tend to do that. Judgments are made on one way or the other. And therefore, the way knowledge is being now expanded to everybody is in contradiction to the historical continuity of the nature of power systems. The political systems that have been developed over the centuries haven't changed all that much. If you look at how power is organized, I look at 3,000 years ago and today, the way power is organized hasn't changed all that much. Who wields power, how it is wielded, how it's institutionalized, how it is organized. And therefore, the gap between the empowerment of so many people and the structure of power has grown enormously. And therefore, you do have the way people are opposing things. For example, to take one example, on one side you say freedom is everything, and that's a value. I would die for freedom. On the other side you say, but order is more important than freedom. What is the point of freedom if there's no order, absolute disorder and anarchy? So, I mean, whether it's a real opposition, but that's the dichotomy which people have used. It influences a lot of actions, political action, way power is used, is often couched in those two terms. So we come back to knowledge, value. If you say you value one or the other, I'm quite interested in how the digital revolution will lead to the point where knowledge is so fragmentized, so atomized, everybody picks up little bits here and there, that we lose the power of organizing it all into one coherent form. And if we fail to do that, the people who know how to do it, who will always be the few, will be the people who control, who wield the power. The order will come from those who know how to wield power, who can bring the fragmentary knowledge into one series and use it to dominate the others. And that may be something, again, throughout history, maybe always been like that. But the fact that we have a digital revolution doesn't protect us as individuals who love freedom from that structure of power which is still there. So I think these are, to me, values. It's not enough to have values. We also must know how to use it, how to organize it so that it actually makes a difference.
Okay, does anyone have one last burning question you want to raise? Any hands? Yes, please, yeah. A microphone should come to you in a minute. Yeah.
A bit frivolous. I'm Barry Clark. I'm Managing Director of Taylor & Francis Asia Pacific. I find myself representing the oldest commercial publisher in the world here in Asia Pacific. I'm glad that Cathy mentioned Koryo Dynasty as a place where the history of the book, the history of information began to take form with the invention of a replaceable type. I've got a challenge, actually, a gauntlet I'd like to throw down to the organizers of the summit of the book, that how wonderful it might be to be able to hold something like this in maybe the next year or 2 years in Pyongyang, where perhaps these debates would have a much more significant effect on society. Thank you.
Well, okay. Are we going to have this debate actually, I must confess, Pyongyang is one of the few cities I've never visited. I've been to many, but maybe we should consider going to Pyongyang. But I mean, Pyongyang is not the only place. I mean, just to give you an example, there are in places where bad news may be coming. And as you know, take another society that is in danger, which is Afghanistan. And if you remember what the Taliban did and the way they destroyed these incredible statues, it was so shocking, You never thought that here in our time, people would do that, destroy such sacred pieces of history and art and culture. But that's happened. So that's why I want to balance the kind of optimism that we have heard with a sense of what would be the dangers. So maybe in 1 minute each, I'm going to ask the 4 panelists to point out, building on the question on Pyongyang, what do you see as the number one danger that we should worry about when we think about the future of the book?
We don't have to go to North Korea. We can go to Durham, North Carolina, where I live, where we have a legislator that says evolution can't be taught anymore, and that falsehoods about reproductive freedoms have to be taught to 7th graders. I mean, lies, things that are lies. So I think this idea of power is extremely important for the future of the book, that in any system, digital or analog, throughout history, power can be abused. And how to teach in a way that where the value of learning how to oppose that kind of opposition, that kind of misuse of power, while still maintaining order is a very, very important balance, and one we must always conscientiously remember.
Gungwu, any word on dangers?
I have very little to add to the rather pessimistic question I asked. I don't actually believe that it's all darkness and gloom. I actually believe human beings can work things out, and it will be worked out. But I think, in other words, what I'm saying is that we can't only think of one problem. They're all actually rather holistic. If we worry about the book and the future of knowledge and wisdom and so on, we have to worry also about how power is distributed. And if we don't reform that, it seems to me all the other progress, the progress that we made, could easily be subverted.
Prasenjit?
Well, I was thinking that I want to sort of end with the note of, why the book? Why is the book important when, in fact, information is being disseminated? Is it that information can be disseminated, but that knowledge somehow is connected to the book, this coherence of meaning that I was talking about? And who will be the organizers of this coherence of meaning once the book has gone? I think is an important one that, as I've said, librarians, among others, and educators should be looking into.
Please, Ismail.
I'm very optimistic.
You are an amazingly optimistic person.
In spite of what's happening in Alexandria right now. So I think the problem has always been these zealots who at various periods in history take over with a particular point of view and think that they have somehow the truth and that everybody else is wrong and has to conform to their view. But they are standing against the tide of history. And even if there are setbacks where they seem to be winning, they will be swept back. And to my friends here in the audience, I'll just remind them of something. If you think of the Renaissance in Europe, and you say, Florence, the Medicis, Michelangelo, and so on, who remembers Savonarola? A zealot monk who took over Florence, chased out the Medici men, forced the Medici women to burn their fineries in public, confiscated their jewelry and melted it, and went around burning people who he declared heretic until he himself was killed, and then the path continued. But if you were living in Florence under Savonarola and Mr. Serageldin came and told you, don't worry, he is against the tide of history, a mere blip, he will only be a footnote. And you say, are you out of your mind? He's just killed my cousin and he's torturing my brother and he's doing all of this. Look who has the power. But the last 400 years have been an ongoing march of greater freedom, greater independence, greater individualism, greater pluralism, and far better lives for the vast majority of humanity. We're not done with our path. We still have to deal with sustainability and a lot of other issues. But hey, knowledge is fundamental, pluralism, openness, discussion, debate. That's what the books do, that's what libraries do, that's what universities do. Tant bien que mal, they're not perhaps perfect, but this is where it's all at. And we have no reason to be pessimistic. We have every reason to be optimistic given what we've achieved and the direction that we're going. And trust the young people. Trust them. Don't be like Hesiod, 700 BC.
I think you would all agree that that was a brilliant ending. This is the way we all want to leave this meeting. We all want to feel good. The book has been around for 5,000 years. Our work has not been done, but we have come a long way, and let's celebrate. So thank you very much. One more round of applause for this brilliant panel.